Thank you, Dean Sterling, for that nice introduction, and to the team who put together this week. I want to thank them all for inviting me. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you about something that I feel quite passionately about, and that is rhetoric and the New Testament. We live in an age, particularly as presidential campaigns begin to ramp up, in which a common charge against those with whom we disagree is to say that they spout empty rhetoric, or that what they say is just rhetoric. Or sometimes, in popular parlance, it's rhetoric, with no qualifier at all. For examples of this, I turned to that veritable font of all things popular culture, the Twitter sphere. These are all from the past week or so. A tweet from Hillary Clinton says, "I'm running for president to protect our families from the plague of gun violence." And someone responded, "How? Hashtag empty rhetoric." There's a link to an op-ed headline that condemns Trump's reckless, empty rhetoric. A human rights activist working on behalf of refugees in Australia tweeted, "We need refuge from our rhetoric." Someone else responding to a panel on African poverty in Ghana tweeted, "Tired of this hashtag rhetoric. Talk is cheap." Other tweets use propaganda and hollow promises as synonyms for rhetoric, and some contrast hashtag rhetoric with hashtag facts. These are just a few quick examples, but notice they're international, and they come from both sides of the political aisle. What they illustrate is this common use of rhetoric to mean that what the person says is unreliable, devoid of real meaning, somehow not the truth. What I want to underscore today is fourfold, and this is what's on your handout. One, that this idea of rhetoric as empty or cheap talk is a limited and I think problematic view of what rhetoric really is. Two, that the New Testament texts are fundamentally rhetorical in nature. And three, that we ought to be paying close, sustained attention to the rhetoric of New Testament texts, including narrative, and paying close attention to the rhetoric we use when we're talking about or thinking with New Testament texts. Just to give you an idea of how I'd like to proceed this morning, I want to start by taking a panoramic view, thinking together about how rhetoric and language are often perceived, and then focusing in on how New Testament texts are rhetorical and the problems that arise when we ignore this. Then I'll offer some suggestions for how a rhetorical approach can help us to think in fresh ways about New Testament texts. So that's a preview of coming attractions. Let's start with the first claim on your handout. Our modern collapsing of rhetoric with falsehood or propaganda reflects what linguists call semantic drift. That is a change in the meaning of a word. But rhetoric, to go back to its original Greek meaning, is skill in speaking, and it was used to discuss the art of persuasion. To say that a text is rhetorical is to say that it aims to persuade. Many ancient theorists believed that words have the power to shape the soul of those who hear them. That is, many believed that words function psychagogically, which comes from psychagogein, which is the leading of the soul. Roman Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in particular were concerned with this leading of the soul, and it became an important trope in Hellenistic Judaism as well. Plato, for example, has Socrates define rhetoric as the art of, quote, leading the soul through words. And again later, the function of speech is to lead souls by persuasion. This concern for the soul-forming persuasive power of words is not limited to a specific genre, like poetry or oratory or epistolary literature. First-century historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus emphasizes that when he writes history, he says he's sure to include infinite examples of virtue in men whose superiors, whether for piety or for justice or for lifelong self-control or for warlike valor, no city, either Greek or barbarian, has ever produced. Conversely, another ancient historian, Apian, insists that his historical narrative is well worth the study of those who wish to know the measureless ambition of men, their dreadful lust of power, their unwearying perseverance, and the countless forms of evil. In addition to these stated goals of ancient historians, lyric poets like Horace aimed to, he says, speak words at once both pleasing and helpful to life, at once delighting and instructing the reader. We also have ancient novels, and many scholars have discussed the entertainment value of these narratives, but ancient writers also knew that stories could function as a call toward virtue and away from vice. Even Lucian from the 2nd century, who wrote a satirical story that's ironically called A True Story, asserts in his preface that he tells nothing but lies. But then he also insists that his text is not a trivial psychagogy, that leading of the soul, based only on wit and cleverness, but rather a prompt for substantive speculation. The negative view that many people have today, that rhetoric manipulates the truth, doesn't fit well with these ancient views of rhetoric. The empty rhetoric idea also bespeaks a converse conviction about language in general, and it's one that I also find problematic, and that is the assumption that language can and should express a complete, unmediated reflection of reality. This is what's often called a correspondence theory of truth, the view that language reflects or corresponds to an impartial, unambiguous reality. Considering texts through the lens of a correspondence theory of truth assumes that we can gaze passively in and see through the text, as we might see through a freshly cleaned window, to a transparent, clear picture of the world or of truth. The problem with a correspondence theory of truth when we come to texts is, of course, the very nature of language. Language is inherently partial. Language is limited. We cannot say everything, contrary to what some in my profession might think. And sometimes words have to do double duty, which means that language is also inherently ambiguous. The Apostle Paul got it right when he said, "We see through a glass in enigmas, or darkly, and only later will we see face to face." Not only is language limited, but language is linear. That is, we encounter it sequentially, and this affects meaning making. Let me give you a short story as an example. The story goes, when I found the skull in the woods, the first thing I did was call the police. But then I got curious about it. I picked it up and started wondering who this person was and why he had deer horns. Deer horns. It takes a minute, right? But you can feel yourself revise what you originally thought in order to make meaning. That's one of Jack Handy's deep thoughts, if you know Jack Handy. But your brain has to revise what originally it thought in order to make sense. This is the very nature of all language. Hearers or readers need to fill in gaps, to disambiguate, to make interpretive decisions as they go. The New Testament is the same way. Think about the story of the healing of 10 lepers in Luke 17:11-19. The entire miracle is recounted before the reader is told that the one man who returns to thank Jesus is a Samaritan, a foreigner. The sequence is important because it comes as a late parenthetical aside. This would have been an unsettling surprise for any early readers who assumed originally that all 10 of the lepers were Jewish. The only character to respond to Jesus commendably is not an insider Israelite, but a foreigner. And for those who viewed Samaritans with suspicion, the delay in recounting this detail would have made it even more startling. Readers or listeners would have had to revise or retroactively reassess any erroneous assumptions they might have made before, in the same way that you had to revise your understanding of the story. A similar dynamic is often at work in Jesus' parables. The New Testament texts are inherently sequential, limited, partial accounts shaped in particular ways and written to persuade. This is where that understanding of rhetoric that I mentioned before comes in, rhetoric as the art of persuasion. Some New Testament writers even explicitly say that this is what they're doing. John 20:31 says, "These things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that, believing, you might have life in his name." 1 John 5:14, "These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life." That the New Testament texts are fundamentally rhetorical creates certain complications with which we need to grapple. Here's what I mean by this. Over the course of Christian history, we've seen the real-world, real-life effects of people who were convinced, they were persuaded, of how they and others should behave in the world based on their readings of New Testament texts. Sometimes Christians have been persuaded of the diametrically opposite views based on their New Testament texts, as when texts from the New Testament were marshaled as witnesses on both sides of the Civil War, both for slavery and against it. Or when New Testament texts like the Gospel of Matthew were marshaled by Nazis to justify the horrors of the Holocaust, while others like Dietrich Bonhoeffer used the New Testament to oppose Hitler. Or when still today women are advised by some to stay in abusive marriages based on texts like Ephesians 5, while others tell them to get out of abusive marriages, also based on New Testament texts. The book of Acts, just this one book, has been used to support infant baptism and to reject it, to support women in ministry and to say only men should be church leaders, to say that speaking in tongues is the mark of a true Christian, and to say that Christians no longer speak in tongues. Multiple messages can be and have been drawn from the very same New Testament texts. New Testament texts are beautiful and they're profoundly true in many respects, but they're also limited by language. They're not neutral repositories of meaning into which we can gaze passively and discover an unmediated truth. Instead, New Testament texts function as crucial interlocutors in discursive struggles over truth, theology, ethics, and experience that always have been and continue to be ongoing in the life of the Christian church. All of this means that we need to have some serious conversations in Christian communities about how we determine which readings of the New Testament texts are best, which we find most persuasive, and why. I would argue that problematic interpretations arise, in part, when people don't attend to the fact that the texts are rhetorically shaped for particular purposes. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to describe one way of reading the New Testament that's very common in communities of faith, but does not take the New Testament's rhetoricity into account, and that is approaching the New Testament as though it is a map. Some of you may remember a gospel song called "I'm Using My Bible for a Road Map," and you have the words to this on the back of your handout. The song goes, "I'm using my Bible for a road map, 10 commandments, they tell me what to do. The 12 disciples are my road signs, and Jesus will take me safely through. There will be no detours in heaven, no rough roads along the way. I'm using my Bible for a road map. My last stop is heaven some sweet day." This is a lovely sentiment. But my point is that many people do actually read the New Testament as a roadmap for how Christians should behave and how the church should look today. My disclaimer is that I know that if you were trained here or you're a current student here, you know the importance of historical contextualization. You know how important it is to think critically about claims that are being made in the New Testament. But I'd also be willing to bet money that you have encountered or will encounter people who do approach the Bible as a roadmap. Consider Acts again. Some view Acts as a straightforward map for church organizing. The Barna Research Group reports that the current house church movement is growing worldwide. You probably know this is a movement away from meeting together in physical church buildings in favor of meeting in homes without any official leadership. These folks refer to the book of Acts as their model. Now, most of these folks have good intentions, and I don't want to disparage what I think is a desire to live a biblically informed, Christ-directed life. But I also think that this way of reading the New Testament is deeply problematic, and the fact that it's so common is deeply troubling. So there may be no detours in heaven, as the song said, but if you'll indulge me, I'd like to take a slight detour here to dig into this map metaphor for a few minutes. A map is a tool. It's a tool to help us navigate. It's a representation of an area of land that we can ideally use to get to a particular destination. Over time, we've become scientifically and mathematically precise in how we make maps, and so we tend to trust maps as straightforward and reliable, telling us where to go. But in 1931, the father of the field of semantics, Alfred Korzybski, came up with the dictum, "The map is not the territory." By this, he means that a representation of something is not the thing itself. This may seem obvious, but we don't actually often think about the fact that as a representation, even a map is shaped by factors like the time period in which it's created. And here we need only think of a map of the stars from, say, the 17th century, which is limited by the knowledge base that they had, versus a map of the modern sky that we might create based on the Hubble telescope, for example. Maps are shaped by the time period in which they're created. They're also shaped by the ideologies and values that inform the map makers. And so we have to ask, what's included and what's not included in this map? There's a famous 12th century map called the Sawley map, and it includes not just physical landmarks, but also scenes from the Bible and scenes from Greek legends. It even includes paradise, appropriately at the top. So we have to ask, what's included? We should also ask, what's in the center? What's on the periphery? How does scale work? What's big? What's small? What's up? What's down? You have a picture on your handout of the first modern South Up map. The quality is not great, but hopefully you can see the contours of the landmass. This has Australia on the top. It was published in 1979, and it was called MacArthur's Universal Corrective Map of the World. The story is that it was made by an Australian who was tormented for coming from the bottom of the world. Maps send messages. The map is not the territory. Treating it as such can take us where we might not want to go. All of this is important when we're approaching New Testament texts because these books, similarly, are not themselves the territory. Each one is a representation. And what's more, each one is shaped by a person or people whose conceptual world was different from ours. Just like a map, New Testament texts are shaped by the time period in which they're created and the ideologies and values that inform the way their producers think. These factors give rise to the rhetoric of the texts, the various ways they function persuasively. And so just like with maps, we need to ask of the New Testament texts, who or what is included? Who or what's left out? Who or what is in the center and who or what is on the periphery? How does scale work? What's big? What's small? What's emphasized? Ignoring these kinds of questions trivializes the transformative potential that exists in the space between texts and readers. Hannah Arendt, discussing the power of stories, describes a subjective in-between in which individuals and cultures negotiate their existence and mutually constitute each other. This subjective in-between exists between texts and readers as well. Ignoring this obscures the many ways that New Testament texts function rhetorically as productive sites of contestation and articulation, legitimating or undermining communities' aims at social solidarity. All of this means that we ought to be paying close, sustained attention to the rhetoric of New Testament texts. New Testament scholarship offers helpful tools for this, and I'd like to turn to that now. But first, I need to offer a clarifying note. When it comes to New Testament studies, one finds two different approaches, both of which are labeled rhetorical. One has been called the heritage school. This is the approach based on ancient Greek and Roman handbooks about oratory by writers like Cicero and Quintilian. This concerns the classical rhetorical canons, specific systematic oratorical methods by which a successful rhetor or orator persuades his audience. A second school, what's been called the dialectical school, emphasizes the rhetoricity and power dynamics inherent in all language. So here we're focused on this latter category, the relative persuasiveness of all language, rhetoric in that sense. But the first school, the heritage school, looking at classical rhetorical conventions, particularly as evident in the New Testament epistles, contributed to a long-standing disciplinary divide in New Testament scholarship between the study of rhetoric on the one hand and the study of narrative on the other. These two approaches to the New Testament were apparently so different that as recently as 2008, New Testament scholar Vernon Robbins could lament what he called a widespread consensus among scholars that, quote, it's not possible to formulate a rhetorical approach to the Gospels and Acts. For decades, so-called rhetorical New Testament scholarship and narrative New Testament scholarship were cloistered away in separate silos. The assumption was that rhetoric concerns classical formal rhetorical conventions, while narrative concerns plot, character, and point of view. Rhetorical critics study arguments, while narrative critics study stories. Rhetorical critics love Paul, while narrative critics love Jesus. But lately in New Testament scholarship, there have been signs of movement to cross this divide, and with good reason. A telling indicator is the number of so-called turns in New Testament studies of recent decades. One can hardly read around in New Testament scholarship without stumbling on a reference to a literary turn, a narrativist turn, an interpretive hermeneutical turn, a rhetorical turn, or, according to some, a rhetorical half-turn. So many turns might make us dizzy, but the destabilization can also cause us to stumble out of disciplinary boundaries and into new theoretical terrain, where studies of rhetoric and studies of narrative can mutually enrich one another. My view, and I put this on your handout, is that narratives function not only as objects of our hermeneutical inquiry, but also as participants in ongoing discussions of representation and narration, and as active agents of readerly transformation. They're objects, participants, and agents. And this coheres with the views of many ancient writers on the power of narrative. Even going back to Aristotle, we have these two great Aristotelian theoretical texts, Aristotle's Rhetoric, about classical rhetorical conventions, and his Poetics, about narrative. These two texts have circulated in two separate volumes for centuries, but practically speaking, Aristotle recognized that each narrative construction implicitly argues for one way of viewing and experiencing the world over and against other possible configurations. In fact, the Aristotelian definition of rhetoric fits the storyteller's task quite well. Rhetoric is, he writes, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Literary scholar Douglas Hess has argued convincingly, I think, that Aristotle's Poetics actually advances a fourth mode of persuasion, the narrative mode, that complements and completes the other rhetorical modes outlined in his Rhetoric. One way that narratives exert influence is through appeals to imitation. Many ancient writers discuss the reader's powerful tendency to identify with and imitate characters in a story. Livy, for example, writes this about the study of history, which for him includes narrative. He says, what chiefly makes the study of history wholesome and profitable is this, that you should choose for yourself what to imitate. From these mark for avoidance what is shameful. Many ancient writers knew that stories guide behavior and beliefs, and they often sought, therefore, with their storytelling to influence the audience's mind, affect, character, and moral constitution. How then can we shift to thinking about New Testament texts rhetorically? I want to suggest that a subfield from literary theory called rhetorical narratology offers useful resources for this endeavor. Rhetorical narratology was developed primarily by literary scholar James Phelan and later by Michael Kearns. The approach draws together, in Kearns' words, narratology's tools for analyzing texts and rhetoric's tools for analyzing the interplay between texts and contexts in order better to understand how audiences experience narratives. Rhetorical narratology recognizes, contrary to contemporary parlance, that rhetoric is never simply cheap talk, and narrative is never just a story. In Phelan's book, Narrative as Rhetoric, he highlights several points that constitute this kind of approach to narrative. And here I'll just mention 3 and give you some examples. First, Phelan writes, quote, "Narrative is a rhetorical action in which somebody tries to accomplish some purpose by telling somebody else that something happened." In other words, telling a story is a persuasive act in and of itself. In the New Testament, both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles begin, as you know, with formal prologues in which the author explicitly acknowledges that he is, as Phelan would say, trying to accomplish some purpose by telling somebody else that something happened. And as a reminder, the gospel begins this way: "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account or narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." Phelan's second major point regarding a rhetorical approach to narrative is to recognize that the somebody else to whom a narrative is told can be defined in different ways. That is, audiences are variously constituted, and they are responsive to different textual clues. So, for example, Jesus tells a story, the parable of the vineyard, and according to Matthew 21, the chief priests and the Pharisees, one audience, wants to arrest him. But they don't because they fear the crowds, another audience, who regard Jesus as a prophet. Audiences respond differently to different stories. Third, and in light of the first 2, Phelan writes that rhetorical narratology, quote, "shifts emphasis from the author as controller to the recursive relationships among authorial agency, textual phenomena, and reader response." All 3 elements of the communicative act are in view: authorial agency, textual phenomena, and reader response. Mark 2, 8-12 provides a ready example. When the scribes witnessed Jesus forgiving a paralytic's sins, they questioned him, not publicly, but in their hearts, saying, "Why does this fellow speak this way? It's blasphemy." That split second, when the reader hears the scribes, confronts her with a choice. Will she reject their viewpoint and distance herself from them? Or will she decide that they have a valid point and thus experience some kind of cognitive dissonance vis-a-vis Jesus? The ensuing verses clarify the narrator's rhetorical goal. Jesus immediately, Mark's favorite word, discerns their questioning, confronts them, and heals the man, saying, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go home." That the man immediately does so solidifies Jesus' claim to authority and subtly appeals to the reader to identify with the corporate character of the crowd, who are all amazed and glorify God. When the crowd exclaims, "We've never seen anything like this," the story ends. The crowd has the last word in the pericope, literally. So-called curtain lines like these carry great weight. As soon as the crowd speaks them, "We've never seen anything like this," the metaphorical curtain falls on the scene, and the audience is left to ponder their implications. The telling of the tale and what happens within it both contribute to the narrative's rhetorical force. Social psychologists are starting to study how it is that narratives persuade. One, Melanie Green, argues that the unique features of a story, like its plot, setting, or characterization, what Phelan calls textual phenomena, contribute to a narrative's rhetoricity by facilitating what Green calls narrative transportation, or absorption into the story. How many of us have experienced getting lost in a book? My parents used to joke that if I was reading and an earthquake hit, I grew up in California, so this happened, they said that if I was reading and an earthquake hit, I'd be perfectly safe because I'd be off in the world of the story. Green calls this a high transportation state, being completely engrossed in the story. And a truly engrossed reader engages with a story experientially. That is, the reader's processing of the story will be both intense and uncritical. In other words, he's less likely to develop rational counter-arguments and more likely to relate personally to the characters. That contributes to the story's rhetorical force. Consider one feature of stories that epistolary writing, like Paul's letters, typically lacks: character speech. Narratologists agree that what characters say contributes to characterization, and therefore constitutes what Aristotle might call available means of persuasion. What Mary Magdalene, for example, says upon encountering the risen Jesus in the garden subtly invites readers either to reject or to accept her views, to judge her positively or negatively, to relate to her or to disassociate from her. Or consider Peter. When Peter rejects Jesus' passion prediction in Matthew 16, and Jesus responds with, "Get behind me, Satan," there's no question about how we're supposed to judge Peter in that moment. Character speech is always an implicit form of argumentation, functioning just as Socrates described the purpose of speech generally, to lead souls by persuasion. This brings me to my fourth and final point. We ought to be paying close, sustained attention not only to the rhetoric of the New Testament texts, but also to the rhetoric we use to think and talk about them. The ancient view that words, even narratives, shape the souls of those who hear them invites today's leaders in church and society, especially those of us who serve as interpretive guides with both specialized training and institutionalized authority, to consider how our words function rhetorically in the lives of those we lead. How do the New Testament texts we study with our congregants, the speeches we give our constituents, the sermons we proclaim to our parishioners, the stories we tell our students, how do these work rhetorically to transform them as whole people, not just intellectually, but morally, ethically, and spiritually as well? Are we inculcating virtue or vice with our rhetoric? This requires some hard self-examination. I like what Parker Palmer says about this. This is a quote. He says, "Our world is in desperate need of leaders who live what Socrates called an examined life. In critical areas like politics, religion, business, and the mass media, too many leaders refuse to name and claim their shadows because they don't want to look weak. If for some reason," he says, and I doubt that there's anyone like this here, "if for some reason you choose to live an unexamined life, I beg of you, do not take a job that involves other people." I would argue that such self-examination ought to include attention to the rhetoric that we use, especially when talking about or thinking with New Testament texts. So to recap, these are my hopes for you after sitting here listening to me for so long. One, I hope that when you see references in the media to rhetoric as empty or as cheap talk, you'll remember what a limited view that is of rhetoric. Two, I hope that when you read New Testament texts, you'll be paying close, sustained attention to how the rhetoric of that particular passage or book might be functioning. And three, I hope you'll be inspired to help others approach the New Testament not as a map, but as the stories of people who traveled this territory before us. I hope that together in faith communities we can ask, what landmarks in the New Testament writers' limited representations of the world are the same as in our world today, And what has changed since then? What messages are they sending, and how are they sending them? And what are we doing rhetorically when we read and refer to, adopt and adapt New Testament texts in our lives and communities? I think that's when we can move beyond seeing the New Testament as a map to experiencing a transformative journey, and ideally allowing God to lead us where we need to go. Thank you.